March 24, 1945. Eastern bank of the Rhine River, near Wesel, Germany. The air smelled of scorched metal and diesel fumes. Oberstleutnant Klaus Hendrik presses field binoculars against the observation slit of his Tiger II command bunker, his breath condensing in the cold dawn air. The earth trembled, not from artillery this time, but from something far more terrible. Across the muddy waters of the Rhine, through the morning fog that clung to the riverbanks like funeral shrouds, came the tanks, American Shermans, British Churchills, Canadian Rams, an endless procession of armor nose to tail, crossing the pontoon bridges that Allied engineers had thrown across Germany's last natural barrier in a single night. Hendrik counted them methodically at first, 50, 100, 200, before the numbers lost all meaning. They kept coming. The sound was like thunder that refused to end, a mechanical heartbeat that promised Germany's final reckoning. Behind him, in the Trieline where his Panzer battalion should have been marshaled for a counterattack, sat 17 Tiger tanks, magnificent machines, the finest armor Germany had ever produced. And every single one of them was stationary, their fuel tanks nearly empty, their crews sitting in helpless silence as history rolled past them on American gasoline. For years earlier, when Germany's panzers had swept across Poland, France, and into the Soviet steppes, Klaus Hendrik had been a young lieutenant who believed in the invincibility of German engineering and the righteousness of the Reich's cause. The campaigns of 1940 and 1941 had seemed to confirm everything the regime had promised. Swift victories, broken enemies, a new European order forged in steel and fire. The panzer divisions had been the spearhead of blitzkrieg, racing hundreds of miles ahead of infantry, encircling entire armies, bringing nations to their knees in weeks. Fuel had seemed infinite then. The Wehrmacht supply columns stretched back to the horizon, tanker trucks and rail cars ensuring that the panzers never stopped moving. Hendrik remembered the intoxication of those days, the sense that Germany was writing history itself, that nothing could stand before the technical superiority and tactical brilliance of the Panzer arm. He commanded a Panzer IV in France, and the French army, supposedly one of Europe's finest, had collapsed in 6 weeks. The secret his instructors at the Panzer School had taught him was mobility. Keep moving. Never let the enemy consolidate. Strike where he is weakest and drive deep. But mobility required fuel, and by March 1945, the fuel was gone. Germany's petroleum crisis had not emerged overnight. It had been lurking in the shadows since the war's beginning, a mathematical certainty that no amount of battlefield victory could alter. Germany possessed virtually no natural oil reserves. Before the war, the Reich had imported petroleum from the United States, Venezuela, and Romania. When war came, those supply lines were severed, first by British naval blockade, then by the collapse of German strategic position across Europe. By 1945, the Reich's only remaining source of natural crude oil was a Zistersdorf field in Austria, which had used barely enough to lubricate Germany's desperation. The Nazis had known this vulnerability from the start. It was why they had invested billions in synthetic fuel production, building massive Fischer-Tropsch plants that converted coal into liquid fuel. At peak production in 1943, these plants had produced nearly 6 million tons of synthetic fuel annually, roughly 2/3 of Germany's total petroleum supply. But by early 1945, Allied bombing had systematically destroyed these facilities. The Americans had struck the Luna Works near Leipzig 17 times. The British had obliterated the Politz plant on the Baltic coast. One by one, the synthetic fuel installations went dark, and with them, Germany's ability to wage mechanized war. Hendrik had watched his battalion's fuel allocation shrink month by month. In the summer of 1944, his company had received sufficient fuel for operational readiness, enough to move 50 kilometers for an engagement, with reserve for tactical maneuver. By autumn, the allocation had been cut in half. By December, during the desperate gamble of the Ardennes offensive, fuel had been so scarce that German planners had counted on capturing American fuel dumps to sustain the attack. When that fantasy failed, hundreds of panzers ran dry in Belgian forests, abandoned by crews who walked back toward Germany. Now, in March 1945, Hendrik's battalion received barely enough fuel to start the engines and move the tanks into defensive positions. There would be no counterattacks, no sweeping maneuvers. The panzers had become steel pillboxes, and even that role was temporary. Eventually, they would run completely dry and become nothing more than monuments to Germany's defeat. Across the Rhine, the Allied forces moved with a logistical sophistication that Hendrik had come to regard with a kind of horrified fascination. He had captured American supply manifests after the Ardennes fighting, and the numbers had left him numb. The United States Army consumed 1 million gallons of gasoline per day in a European theater. 1 million. The figure was so staggering that Hendrik had initially assumed it was a typographical error, but intelligence reports confirmed it. The Americans moved on an ocean of petroleum. Every Sherman tank carried 175 gallons of fuel and consumed nearly 2 gallons per mile of travel, yet they never seemed to run dry. Behind every American armored division came a logistics apparatus that dwarfed the combat units themselves. Tanker trucks organized in convoy. Fuel bladders holding thousands of gallons, portable pipelines that could be laid across liberated territory at the pace of the advance. The Americans had built a fuel pipeline from England to France, under the English Channel, capable of pumping 2,000 gallons per minute directly to the front. They call it Operation Pluto, pipeline under the ocean. When Hendrik had learned of this, he had laughed bitterly. Germany was scraping the bottom of its fuel reserves, and America was laying pipelines across the ocean floor. The contrast was not merely quantitative. It represented entirely different philosophies of war, different national capacities, different worlds. Germany had waged war on the assumption of quick victory, of conquest that would bring new resources into the Reich's possession before the old ones ran out. It was a gambler's strategy, a blitzkrieg economy that counted on winning before the mathematical realities of industrial production could assert themselves. America waged war from the opposite premise, that industrial capacity, resource abundance, and logistical sustainment would inevitably triumph over battlefield brilliance. The Americans did not need to be brilliant. They simply needed to be thorough, patient, and inexhaustible. Hendrik watched the tanks cross the Rhine and understood that this was what defeat looked like in the modern age. Not a dramatic battlefield reversal, not a heroic last stand, but suffocation. Germany was being strangled by American productivity, buried under American steel, and now, immobilized by the absence of American petroleum. His crews had adapted as best they could. They had learned to conserve every liter, to shut down engines whenever possible, to use gravity and terrain to minimize fuel consumption during positioning. They had become experts in fuel management, calculating precise consumption rates, sharing fuel between tanks to keep a few operational rather than leaving all partially fueled. It was an expertise born of desperation, and Hendrik knew it changed nothing. Even if they husbanded their remaining fuel perfectly, they had perhaps enough for one engagement, one brief defensive action before the tanks fell silent forever. The Tiger II was a magnificent machine. Its 88mm gun could destroy any Allied tank at 2 kilometers. Its frontal armor was nearly impenetrable. But magnificence without fuel was useless. The Americans did not need to outfight the Tigers. They simply needed to outlast them, and with 500 tanks crossing the Rhine in a single day, outlasting was a certainty. Hendrik had found a small object in his pocket that morning before dawn, a fuel ration token from 1942, a small metal disc stamped with an eagle and swastika, marked for 20 liters. He had carried it as a good luck charm through 2 years of fighting. Now he held it up to the dim light filtering through the observation slit and turned it over in his fingers. The metal was tarnished, the stamping worn. 20 liters. In 1942, 20 liters had seemed like nothing, a trifle, barely worth accounting for. Now, 20 liters was a treasure, enough to move a tank 2 kilometers, enough for a brief tactical repositioning. He had watched his men scavenge fuel from abandoned vehicles, draining tanks drop by drop into jerry cans, pooling the dregs of Germany's mechanized might. The fuel token had become a relic from another age, a memento of abundance that seemed as distant now as the victories of 1940. The official reports from Berlin spoke of wonder weapons still to come, of jet fighters and super heavy tanks, and revolutionary new technologies that would turn the tide. Hendrik no longer believed the reports. He had seen the V-2 rockets launched against England, had heard the propaganda about vengeance, weapons that would break British morale. But V-2 rockets ran on alcohol fuel and liquid oxygen, and launching them had consumed resources that could have kept Panzers moving. Every wonder weapon was a choice to invest scarce resources in spectacular gestures rather than practical sustenance. The jets were impressive machines, but they consumed fuel at prodigious rates and required special synthetic fuel that the Reich could no longer produce in sufficient quantity. Germany had chosen spectacle over logistics, and now it was paying the price. Across the Rhine, the Americans had no wonder weapons. They had ordinary tanks, ordinary trucks, ordinary soldiers, but they had them in unlimited quantity, fueled by an industrial base that Germany could never match and never strangle. By midday, Hendrik had counted more than 500 tanks crossing the Rhine, and the procession showed no sign of stopping. His radio man reported that other crossings were occurring up and down the river at Remagen, where the Americans had captured a bridge intact weeks earlier at Oppenheim, at Boppard. The Rhine barrier, Germany's last hope for delaying the inevitable, had been breached in dozens of places simultaneously. There would be no concentrated counterattack because there was no fuel for concentration. The Panzer divisions that remained were scattered in defensive positions, each battalion isolated, waiting for an enemy who could choose when and where to engage them. Hendrik imagined the American commanders studying their maps, noting the locations of German armor, and simply bypassing them. Why fight a Tiger tank when you could drive around it? The Germans could not pursue. They could not reposition. They could only sit and watch as the war moved past them. That evening, as darkness fell and the rumble of Allied armor continued unabated, Hendrik called his officers together in the command bunker. He held up the fuel ration token, showed it to them, and told them what it represented. "This is what we wagered," he said quietly. "We bet that our tanks could move faster and strike harder than the enemy could organize. We bet that we could win before the fuel ran out. We lost that bet." No one spoke. What was there to say? They were professional soldiers, and they understood the mathematics of warfare. An army without fuel was not an army. It was a collection of waiting targets. Hendrik placed a token on the map table between them, this small metal disc that symbolized the vanished age of German mobility, and told them to prepare for defensive action. When the Americans came, and they would come with their unlimited fuel and their overwhelming numbers, the Tigers would fight from fixed positions. They would destroy as many enemy tanks as their ammunition allowed. And then, when the shells ran out, they would surrender or retreat on foot, leaving the magnificent machines behind as monuments to a war Germany could never have won. In the years after the war, when historians tallied the causes of Germany's defeat, they would cite many factors: Hitler's strategic blunders, the entry of the United States into the war, the vastness of the Soviet Union, the crushing superiority of Allied air power. But beneath all these factors lay a simpler truth, one that Klaus Hendrik had understood while watching 500 tanks cross the Rhine. Germany had waged war against enemies whose resources it could never exhaust, whose production it could never match, and whose fuel supplies it could never interdict. The Third Reich had built the finest tanks in the world, had trained elite Panzer crews, had developed tactical doctrines of unprecedented sophistication. But it had built all of this on a foundation of petroleum scarcity that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. The fuel token in Hendrik's pocket was more than a souvenir. It was a symbol of the gap between German ambition and German capacity, between what the Reich wanted to accomplish and what its resources permitted. 20 liters, once abundant, now precious, soon gone entirely. The sound of Allied tanks crossing the Rhine continued through the night, a mechanical thunder that spoke of American industrial might, of petroleum abundance, of a kind of warfare that Germany had never truly understood. Hendrik sat in the darkness of his bunker, listening, knowing that somewhere across that river, American tankers were refueling their Shermans from trucks that would be refilled tomorrow, and the next day and the day after, as many times as necessary until Germany surrendered. The war had become a question of logistics, and logistics had become a question of fuel, and fuel was something that only one side possessed in the quantities that modern war demanded. When dawn came again, the Panzers would still be sitting silent in their positions, magnificent machines rendered impotent by empty tanks, while across the Rhine, the endless procession of Allied armor continued its inexorable advance into the heart of the Reich, powered by the one resource Germany could never replicate: the limitless petroleum abundance of American victory.